Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. And I'm really excited about this show because my guest for this show has been on my bucket list for a really long time. Rupert Sheldrake is a biologist and author of more than 90 technical papers and 14 books. After studying at Cambridge and Harvard, he worked in Hyderabad, India as a principal plant physiologist. He's also lived for 2 years in the Benedictine ashram of Father B. Griffiths. He's currently a fellow of the Institute of Noetic Sciences and of Schumacher College. He lives in London. He's been celebrated and vilified for his book, A New Science of Life, The Hypothesis of Morphic Resonance. His most recent book is Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, the second in a series, the first of which was Science and Spiritual Practices. His website is sheldrake.org, sheldrake.org. Great to have you on the show.
Good to be with you, Rob.
So my first question is, what do you want your legacy to be? How would you like your time on Earth to have left a mark?
I think largely through a change in the way science is done and the relations between science and the world of spirituality. Because the dominant view within the sciences all my life has been mechanistic materialism, the idea that nature is made up of unconscious matter, everything's machine-like, even our own bodies and brains, and that there's no purpose in the universe. When you die, that's the end of it. Religion's a waste of time, if not actually pernicious. You know, that worldview is the standard worldview that I was educated into as a young man, and actually believed for a while, and now think is doing great harm, not only to people's mental life, but also to the planet and to science itself, because I think it's very restrictive and holding science back.
Okay. Did you get a chance to look at my book, The Bottom Up Revolution, at all?
I wish I had. I'm sorry I didn't. No, I was sort of, I've been super busy. And
all right, so let me, my book, The Bottom Up Revolution, is, and I wanted to show your book too. Your book is Ways to Go Beyond.
Yes.
My book, The Bottom Up Revolution, basically posits that humans before civilization lived in a kind of a bottom-up way of living. And I'm really struggling because you describe bottom-up as almost the opposite in terms of the Hobbesian concept, which we'll get into. But my idea is we evolved in hunter-gatherer bands and tribes and lived that way for literally millions of years, including our predecessors. And
Yes.
we evolved hundreds of genes that are designed to help us work together, to cooperate, to be interdependent, to be kind and have compassion and empathy. And basically civilization came along, changed that. In terms of science, so top-down science is like you described, mechanistic, atomistic, counting, breaking things apart. It worked for a lot of simple things. It didn't work for quantum physics. It didn't work for ecological systems and complex systems. So they came up with chaos theory and systems theory, which is based on looking at patterns and interactions. And that's a kind of a quick overview. I got into it because I started taking a bottom-up approach to running my website, and it just took off like crazy. So I started a radio show, this show, Bottom Up Show, where I've interviewed people with different takes on bottom up. But then you're making me crazy because you refer to the Hobbesian view of selfishness as a bottom up way of seeing things. And I see it the opposite. I see bottom up as the caring way. But so.
Well, I think this is clearly just a different, we've attached the bottom up concept to different things. But, I would say that the basis of my own thinking is the holistic view that at each level of nature, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And for a human society, the way you've described it in your bottom-up view, then the society is essentially cooperative. So individuals are part of a cooperative network, if I understand you correctly. Well, that's more or less what I'm saying too. you see, the cooperative network is, in a tribal group, would be the whole tribe, or in a family, the family, or in the older view of the nation, it would be the nation. Individuals are part of these larger groups within which they cooperate, or within a football team, it would be a football team, and the individuals would be part of that. And the point about Hobbes was that he was trying to get rid of that view that the nation has a unity, that the family has a unity. It's just about individuals, because it's just about atoms, and they're the atoms of society. So within the context that I'm coming from, the bottom-up view is atomistic. Within the context you're coming from, it's a kind of cooperative network, which I wouldn't really see as a bottom-up view. I would see it as a local community view, but I wouldn't call that bottom-up. I'd call it a social interacting, a social unit within which individuals interact.
Well, I think we agree that Hobbes, Hobbes literally defined the view of the prehistoric world and early humans as brutal and savage beasts.
Yes, brutal, nasty, and short is how he defined human life in the terms of what he thought of as so-called primitive life. Yes, I think we agree about that. And I think we also agree that humans have evolved with cooperative instincts. I mean, that's part of our nature, is to be cooperative. A large part of it is to be cooperative. I think the inheritance of this as being more a matter of morphic resonance than a matter of genes. But again, that's a difference of interpretation of inheritance. But I think we both agree that there's a long evolutionary history which has shaped us to be cooperative.
Okay, so you brought up the words morphic resonance, and you can't have a conversation with you, I think, without really having, for new listeners, without you really explaining what morphic resonance is.
All right. Morphic resonance is a memory principle in nature. And what I'm saying in the most broad terms is that there's a memory inherent in nature. The so-called laws of nature are more like habits. Each species has a kind of collective memory on which all individuals draw and to which they contribute. And the basis for this memory, at all these scales, in chemistry, in physics, in biology, in psychology, is the process of morphic resonance. And the word morphic means form or shape. Resonance means similar patterns of vibration that interact. And what I'm suggesting is that similar self-organizing patterns of activity are influenced across time by similar patterns in the past. So there's a kind of resonance across time, which is the basis of memory. And the reason this is so controversial is that, first of all, regular physics doesn't have resonance across time within it. And secondly, it leads to a view of memory as not being stored in the brain. It leads to the idea the brain is more like a tuning device, tuning into memories rather than a video recorder which is storing them. And most scientists simply assume or take it for granted that memories must be in the brain. Despite decades of failure in finding them, they assume they must be there because where else could they be? And my answer to that is that the problem, where else, is the wrong question, because memory is a relation in time, not in space. And so I think morphic resonance is basically saying that the basis for memory in nature is similarity. And this happens between systems which are self-organizing, which includes molecules, atoms, plants, animals, cells, planets, solar systems. It doesn't include machines, chairs, tables, etc., because they're not self-organizing, they're made in factories. So it's something that applies to basically all of nature. I'm saying all of nature has a memory. And it's unfamiliar in the Western world, but in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, it's been their standard view of nature for millennia. You know, they think of, no, they don't use the word morphic resonance, but they think there's a kind of memory in the world.
And we have the idea of archetypes. I think that fits under there too.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Archetypes, according to Jung, are in the collective unconscious. They're like collective memories in the collective unconscious. He thought that the archetypes in the collective unconscious were collective memories. For example, millions of people have had the experience of being babies and feeding at the breast of their mother. So that the kind of average of all that experience becomes a kind of archetypal pattern of the mother's breast and its nurturing power and so on. So he saw these as collective memories. There's a distinction, of course, between Jung's idea of archetypes and Plato's idea of archetypes. In Platonic philosophy, the archetypes are beyond space and time. They're like eternal forms or principles. But I'm talking about archetypes more in the Jungian sense.
Okay. Now, you said that the wrong question is where. What's the right question?
I suppose how. How does memory work? You see, just take ordinary human memory. I mean, most people find this very surprising because all of us have been brought up to believe memory must be stored somewhere inside the brain. You know, modified nerve endings, phosphorylated proteins, possibly DNA or RNA molecules, something like that. And scientists have spent ages looking for these. They've tried all sorts of ingenious techniques to find memories, and over again, they haven't. And I think that's because they're not there. I think that if I looked at your TV set and analyzed the wires and transistors to find out what you'd watched on it last night, if you had watched something on it last night, I wouldn't find out what you'd watched by analyzing traces of the program in your TV set. That's not how it works. So I think that then the question is not where, but how does it work? And the answer is that memory is a relation in time. And because it's a relation in time, we have to look at a process in time, which I think is a matter of resonance across time. It's an unfamiliar concept, and it's a new idea. That's why it's controversial. I mean, it may be untrue as well. That's another question, but it fits the facts quite well. And I think helps us to understand the evolution of the universe better. Because the standard view is that the whole universe originated at the Big Bang with fixed laws of nature that were already there, mysteriously, completely fixed at the very moment of the Big Bang. It's not explained how they got to be there or what they are, but it's assumed they were fixed. And they've never changed ever since. Whereas in a radically evolutionary universe, it makes more sense to have the regularities of nature evolving. The laws are more like habits.
You know, when I think about quantum physics and the ideas that matter fluctuates between being energy and being matter, and it's kind of waveform like in nature. And one of the models is that a waveform can appear one moment here and another moment the other side of the universe. That kind of makes me think that maybe that's tied in with this whole model that you have of morphogenic fields. Is it? I mean, can you get into the physics of a little bit?
Well, I think it could be related to quantum physics. I mean, I don't try and explain it in terms of quantum physics because quantum physics is really the physics of the very small. I mean, it does apply to larger things like lasers, but basically it's the physics of microscopic particles, electrons, atoms, and so on. And so I think that if we try and explain consciousness or morphic resonance or anything else in terms of quantum physics, we're trying to collapse down too many levels. It's rather reductionist, going to the smallest things.
Don't want to do that. Don't want to do that.
Well, that is unfortunately what bottom-up explanation usually involves. You start from the smallest possible units and you try and build it up. And so, you know, in molecular biology, they try and explain life in terms of genes, proteins, and other molecules because they're the smallest things. Therefore, from a reductionist point of view, they have the highest credibility. Smallest is best from that point of view. But I mean, where I think the point you're raising is important is that in quantum theory, there's now, among other mysterious properties, quantum non-locality. Particles that have been linked together remain connected at a distance, over any distance. And this is part of the way the world works. I think that something similar is happening with morphic resonance, but morphic resonance is not just across space, it's across time as well, which goes beyond quantum non-locality or quantum entanglement.
Okay. And I wanted to ask, I jumped ahead, what are the most important messages and ideas you want people to take away from all of your work and writings?
Well, I suppose, dealt with that to some extent when you put it in the form of what do I want to remain when I'm dead? I suppose the most important thing is the idea we live in a living universe. The universe is more like an organism than a machine. It's the animals and plants are more like organisms and machines. They are literally living organisms, whereas mechanistic biology treats them as machines, purposeless machines. That our minds are more extensive than our brains. Our minds are normally rooted in our heads, in our brains, but extend far beyond them. That the physical world we live in is a creative, evolving world, and that there's consciousness or mind inherent in many aspects of nature, not just inside human heads. And that underlying and permeating the natural world are many forms of consciousness beyond the human level, that spirituality is about direct experience of other forms of consciousness beyond the human level. And that through studying spiritual practices scientifically, we can bring together science and spirituality in a mutually illuminating and constructive way, instead of thinking of science and spirituality or religion as being opposed forces. One has to destroy the other, you know, the kind of Richard Dawkins view. I think that when we start studying spiritual practices like meditation, yoga, singing and chanting, prayer, these kinds of practices have measurable physiological effects. They have measurable effects on people's brain activity. They have measurable effects on well-being, usually very positive. They have measurable effects on longevity. People who have religious or spiritual practices usually are happier, healthier, and live longer than those that don't. And so we have a way that science and spirituality can have common ground by being investigated. Scientific methods can investigate spiritual practices, and spiritual practices can illuminate changes in physiology, well-being, health, which are important for all of us. So I think these are the things that matter to me most.
Okay, so you talk about consciousness. Can you what are your ideas about consciousness? I've read some, I've listened to you speak about it. So how do you describe what is consciousness? There's consciousness, there's unconsciousness. You talk about the sun being conscious.
Yes.
What is consciousness?
Well, first of all, it's not really a thing, it's a process. So obviously you're never going to be able to crystallize consciousness and put it in a test tube. I think that the difference between our conscious and our unconscious minds is that our unconscious mind, which is the bulk of our mind, is unconscious. So the word consciousness and mind are not the same. Otherwise, we wouldn't need the word unconscious mind to distinguish between them. Unconscious minds are primarily about habits and what are our habits. And when I'm driving a car, I don't need to think about every gear shift or everything I do. It comes fairly automatically, and so does riding a bicycle, or in my case, playing the piano, because I played it for years. All these things depend on habits. When I'm speaking English, it flows freely and automatically. It's a habit. I don't need to think about all these things. So they're habits. Consciousness is about the things where we need to make choices. So consciousness is about choosing among possibilities. And if we have no possibilities to choose among, then we're not conscious. But if we have a range of possible actions that we can choose among, then that's where consciousness comes in. It's a container of possibilities.
So when I researched top-down and bottom-up brain, what I learned from neuroscientists is they look at top-down brain as the what we're using to filter our raw experience. So, and it's most of what our brain does. It's like 95, 98% is that filtering process that already exists. And I would say that compares to your unconsciousness.
Yes.
And that leaves a tiny percentage that we are actually conscious of, or we're actually making a decision on what we're going to see and experience.
Yes, that's right. I think, and even what we see, a lot of the processing of that is completely unconscious. You know, if I look at a tree, I instantly know it's a tree, and the word tree comes into my mind straight away. But when I was a baby, I didn't know the word tree. I had to learn that. And I didn't know what a tree was until I'd seen quite a few trees and heard people say that's a tree. So that recognition of the tree, the very fact we can perceive things and recognize the things we see, the names and forms, the names we recognize, the names that we know and the forms we recognize, are contents of consciousness. And most of that is based on automatic mental activity and brain processing. So I think this is true of animals as well. I mean, for example, a bee flies into a garden and there's lots of different flowers there. And the bee has a choice between which flowers it goes and takes nectar or pollen from. And this will be shaped partly by its instincts, partly by its memory, partly by what other bees may have communicated to it, or partly things it smelled in the hive. But it has a choice. And when it goes into that garden, it sees all these different flowers. And I think it's conscious of all those different flowers and their colors. And then chooses to land on one rather than another. But its instinct to collect pollen or nectar, the way it behaves when it gets in the flower, these are all instinctive, habitual responses. And I don't think those are conscious. But so I'd imagine the bee's mind is conscious of things that it has to choose among, like which flower to land on.
So what's the value of consciousness? If most of our experience is unconscious, what's the value of consciousness?
We're choosing between possible actions. The bee can choose one flower rather than another. You and I chose to meet now and to talk together. We could have chosen not to.
Thank you.
When we'd made that choice, you know, there were all sorts of, you could have invited all sorts of other people to be on your program today, and you know, I could have been somewhere else doing something else. There were many possibilities in your mind and mine, and we both chose to do this. And once we've chosen to do that, then this is what's happening. It's a choice, but it's a choice out of range of possible choices. And the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who was you know, a British philosopher who was writing in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, one of the great organismic or holistic philosophers of the 20th century, argued that consciousness is primarily about choice, about possible futures. And he thinks that kind of mental process, or something like it, permeates all nature. In quantum physics, the equation for an electron, the Schrödinger wave equation, which quantum physicists use for their calculations, doesn't tell you what the electron is. It tells you all the possible things the electron could do. It spells out all those possibilities. And when an electron interacts with something, all those possibilities collapse into what you actually observe. It's called the collapse of the wave function. So you've got something there that's analogous to conscious choice. I'm not saying necessarily the electron is conscious of this, but even at the realm of the electron, you have, everyone agrees, an equation specifies possibilities. Those possibilities are not physical facts. They don't exist in the physical realm. Possibilities are not physical. They only become physical when a choice is made between them, and now there's an observable fact. And so in a quantum experiment, of all the possible things this electron could do, when it interacts with a photographic film or something, all those possibilities collapse to an observable dot you can see on a photographic plate. But before that, the possibilities are spread out. And the same is true of our consciousness. It's always full of possibilities for possible actions. So it's always directed towards virtual futures, things we could do. And even when you take perception, you walk into a garden, like a bee goes into a garden, and you have a choice of which flower do you look at, or maybe you don't look at any of them at all. You look for the nearest ice cream stall or something. You have a choice of what you pay attention to, and different people pay attention to different things. If you're hungry, you pay attention to food. If you've had a lot of food, you're not so interested. You pay attention to something else. So there's always this selective quality of attention, and that's what consciousness and intention, what you intend to do, what your aims or goals are. And consciousness lives in that realm. That's my view.
And in your book, this is one of two books that you've done on tying spirituality and science.
Yeah.
You're encouraging people to engage in different spiritual practices, and you itemize 14 of them between the two books, and you describe how those can change people's consciousness and affect them in very interesting ways. I love your idea of pilgrimage versus tourism.
Yes.
That people kind of rejected pilgrimage, and they go on tourism. They become tourists, and they go to places where people used to go on pilgrimages. And the reason I loved it is because when I travel, I like to find spiritual places.
Yes.
Whether it's a burial mound or an old church, and I like to meditate there and try to reconnect with the energy that has passed through there.
Yes. Well, very much so, yes. I think the more general point of the spiritual practices is that there are many spiritual practices we can do either within or outside an organized religion. And there are a lot of people who call themselves spiritual but not religious. And I think they have a good point that you can be spiritual. You can meditate, you can go on pilgrimage without necessarily signing up to a particular religion. When a lot of people who rejected the religion of their ancestors and became atheists or agnostics, stopped the various spiritual practices that go with religion, which include singing together, meeting together, rituals, festivals, prayer, rites of passage. There's a whole range of phenomena which people practice as part of a religion. And if you stop doing all those, it usually impoverishes people's lives, which is why a lot of atheists are now trying to reinvent spirituality. Sam Harris, the noted new atheist, is now giving online meditation courses. And Alain de Botton, a leading British atheist philosopher, wrote a book called Religion for Atheists, trying to reinvent religion for atheists because he thinks they're missing out on spiritual practices. So I think spiritual practices, now known to have value for people's health and well-being through scientific studies, and also to make people feel more connected and satisfied in their lives. These are available to all of us, and that's why I wrote these books. And as in relation to pilgrimage, I mean, what's so interesting there is that in Europe at the moment, there's an enormous revival of pilgrimage going on. It was suppressed in the Protestant countries. At the Protestant Reformation pilgrimage was abolished in England, Germany, Scandinavia, the main Protestant countries in Europe. The Protestants didn't like it. It wasn't abolished in Catholic countries like Ireland, Italy, Spain, etc. But it dwindled, and by the 1960s or 70s, there were very, very few people going on pilgrimages in most parts of Europe. But in the 1980s, a group of people in Spain revived the old footpath pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. 1987, about 1,000 people walked it soon after they reopened the route. Last year, about 300,000 walked that route. And it's so popular in Europe, and indeed many people go from America to do it, that there's a kind of revival of pilgrimage happening all over Britain and all over France.
And you describe how it doesn't have to be this long, multiple-day trip. It can be something much simpler than that. You've described
much simpler, yes. In fact, well, every year I do a one-day pilgrimage with a godson of mine.
Godson.
He's a teenage, he's 19 now, but we started when he was 14. Every year we walk the last 5 or 6 miles to one of the leading cathedrals in England. We started with Canterbury, then we went to Ely, then Lincoln, then Wells, then Winchester, this year Chichester. We walk through fields. These are not on roads. In Britain, we have a whole network of public footpaths, so you can walk on private land through woods and fields legally. It's just part of our heritage. So you can walk through these fields on public footpaths, often on ancient pilgrimage routes, through villages where you can visit ancient churches, holy wells, ancient trees. It's a wonderful experience of linking to the countryside. And then all these cathedrals are medieval. They were built in, 1200, 1300, that kind of time. Hugely impressive buildings designed to change one's state of consciousness. So going there, lighting a candle, saying a prayer, going to choral evensong, which is an evening service in all English cathedrals. The choirs sing extraordinarily beautiful evening prayer service, quite brief. We do that every year, and it's immensely satisfying. And it's not like 18 days to Canterbury from Southampton, which is the main pilgrimage route to Canterbury. And one can go on short pilgrimages anywhere. There has to be a destination. It doesn't have to be an ancient building. It can be the source of a river, a holy well, an ancient tree. But the difference between pilgrimage and just going for a walk is that you go with an intention. You want to give thanks for something, or ask for something, or connect with that place. And so you go with an intention, and that intention makes the journey different from just going for a stroll or a ramble or a hike.
That's beautiful. We need to take a brief break, so I just have to pause for the radio show for 10 seconds.
Okay. And I'll turn off.
And my guest for the show is Rupert Sheldrake. My guest for the show is Rupert Sheldrake. He's a biologist and author of more than 90 technical papers and 14 books. He is most famous probably for his book, which has been celebrated and vilified, A New Science of Life, the hypothesis of morphic resonance and that theory. And he's got 2 new books out, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, and Science and Spiritual Practices. And we've been talking about the spiritual practices. How do the spiritual practices tie in with morphogenic field theory and morphogenic resonance?
Morphic resonance, yes. Morphogenetic field theory. And incidentally, my book, A New Science of Life, in its 3rd edition, has been retitled in the US, Morphic Resonance. It's still called A New Science of Life here in Britain. Well, morphic resonance, as we were discussing earlier, is about memory and resonance across time based on similarity. So some spiritual practices depend on that quite strongly. Perhaps the one that does most obviously, is rituals. All cultures have rituals. All religions have rituals. Ritual meals. For example, the American Thanksgiving dinner is a ritual meal. It's a national ritual. And in rituals, what people do is they do things in a similar way as possible to the way it's been done before. So you have standardized foods, you have gestures, you have ritual languages, phrases, words, things like incense in the case of church services and so on. There are various things that are parts of rituals in all cultures, in all traditions. And I think that what's happening there is in a ritual, people are deliberately reenacting a set of actions, words, phrases, chants, or whatever, the way it's been done before. That sets up conditions for morphic resonance and means that present participants are connected with those who've done it before, back through the ancestors to the first time the ritual happened. So when Jewish people, for example, celebrate the Passover, they're reenacting the original Passover dinner in Egypt, many, many, many generations ago. But they're also connecting with all those Jewish people who celebrated it since then. So there's a presence of the past in the ritual that connects the present participants to all those who've done it before. And part of the power of rituals is to give this sense of connection across time. All spiritual practices are really about connection, connecting us, our own individual lives, with a larger social group, with larger forms of consciousness, and connecting us across time. And in the case of pilgrimage, then if you go to an ancient sacred place, like, for example, a temple in India, or a Sufi shrine in India, or a Christian cathedral, then going to that ancient sacred place, you're going to a place where people have prayed, meditated, had spiritual experiences before. And when you enter that place, you come into resonance with all those who've been there before. It looks the same, probably smells very similar. You're exposed to the same stimuli. That brings you into resonance with the morphic resonance with those who've been there before. So you tap into a kind of collective memory in that place. And that's the reason that these places, I think, have, in many cases, so much power. They have an effect on people who visit them that's way beyond just going to an old building. There's something much more to it than that.
I love it. But I interrupted you, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that some of these spiritual practices, morphic resonance is a key part of. It's not necessarily part of all of them. I mean, morphic resonance is a theory of memory in nature. Some spiritual practices, for example, meditation, I have a morphic resonance component. If you use a mantra, then you're tuning in to all those who've used that same mantra before. If you use mindfulness meditation, where you're observing breathing or sensations in the body, you don't have that mantra connection, but it helps to bring you in the present. And the point of that kind of practice is to come into the present, to let go of the train of thought that's, or not be so attached to the thoughts that continually go through one's mind. But that's less morphic resonance based than, say, rituals. So it's not a one-size-fits-all theory of, say, spiritual practices.
You say atheism cuts people off from sources of well-being and connection, and I'm particularly interested in the connection part. I mean, what you're describing is how by engaging in these practices, people can connect with the morphic resonance field. There's a kind of an energy there that it's a subtle energy. Is it in any way measurable?
Well, most fields are measurable through their effects. I mean, you measure the gravitational field through gravitational effects, pendulum swinging and that sort of thing. You don't measure the gravitational field with an electric meter, a voltmeter. You measure volts with a voltmeter. You measure electrical fields. You measure magnetic fields with magnetometers. You don't measure them with gravitational detection devices. So if you measure morphic fields, you measure them through morphic effects. And these are usually memory effects. And so the whole hypothesis is testable, but there's no reason to assume that these fields should be detected through an voltmeter or something, because you don't detect most fields in nature through voltmeters, only electric fields.
Now, you've mentioned one example of evidence of morphic fields is crystallization. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this is based on the principle that nature is habitual. If you make a new chemical compound that's never existed before, then it hasn't formed crystals before. There isn't a morphic field for those crystals ready-made. You have to wait for a new one to appear. Now, no one knows how the creativity of nature works, but it certainly is there, otherwise there'd be no evolution. So anyway, chemists, when they make a new compound, often wait months, even years, before crystals form. But after they've formed once, they mysteriously become easier to form elsewhere. And after it's been formed hundreds or thousands of times, it gets easier and easier for crystals to form all around the world. And the usual explanation chemists give is that they admit the phenomenon. They don't deny this is happening, but they say, oh, well, this happens because little bits of previous crystals get wafted around the world as invisible dust particles and nucleate crystallizations in other parts of the world. It may play a part, but it's an untested hypothesis. So my point is that if you filter dust particles out, you should see this anyway because of morphic resonance. And another experiment to test it is if you train rats to learn a new trick in, say, San Francisco, then rats all around the world should be able to learn that trick quicker just because they've learned it in San Francisco. And surprisingly, there's already evidence that that actually happens as well. So this leads to quite definite testable predictions. And it's a very controversial theory because a lot of scientists don't like the idea and they're opposed to it. But the fact is, it fits the facts just as well as the conventional theory does. And as I show in my book, Science Set Free, current science is based on a set of assumptions which have hardened into dogmas. This is one of those assumptions, the idea the laws of nature are fixed. And there are alternatives to these dogmas which make science more exciting and open up whole new areas of inquiry.
Yeah, there's medication for arteriosclerosis, but not for scientific sclerosis.
That's right. Yes, exactly. There's a real problem with scientific sclerosis because science, the way science is taught, is in a kind of authoritarian way. I mean, students in schools and colleges aren't expected to do original scientific research and challenge the foundations of science. I mean, the way anything's taught is you learn the orthodoxy. And because science is very specialized, most people are in no position to challenge it. And it's also grown up with a peculiarly authoritarian, monopolistic view of truth. That in the realm of religion, for example, we're used to the idea there are many religions, and within each religion, say Christianity, there's lots of different kinds, Pentecostalists, Catholics, Protestants, Seventh-day Adventists, Baptists, and so on. Within Islam, within Hinduism, within Buddhism, there's many schools. There's a plurality. But there isn't anything like that in science. There's the idea that one kind of science is the right kind at any given time, and this is the kind that should be taught in the entire world, India, China, South America, North America, Europe, Africa. Everyone should learn the same kind of science, so the textbooks are virtually the same all around the world. So you get this idea that science is not pluralistic, that there's a huge authority attached to this kind of science as the one universal system of belief. And I think that's terribly unhealthy for science, and I think it would be much better if it was more pluralistic. One of the problems of that way of thinking that's so familiar in science, we don't notice how dogmatic it's become. One of the problems is that if you disagree with any of these dogmatic beliefs. Instead of saying, well, let's have a debate about it, let's look at these different opinions, it's branded as heresy. And so the word heresy is used much more today in the context of science than it is in the context of religion or politics, because there's a true view and there's a heretical view. And if you have a heretical view, there's very little tolerance for it within the scientific world. So this is simply a fact. I mean, I've experienced this the hard way, but, you know.
But tell about your nature, about what happened with you in nature, just to give an example.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't like, I mean, I'd like, just before I do that, I mean, I don't like to sort of moan. It's not my temperament or mentality or purpose here, but it's simply a fact that I wrote a book, the book you mentioned, A New Science of Life, putting forward the idea of morphic resonance, on an alternative view of inheritance and memory and evolution in biology, including not just genes, not just epigenetic inheritance, as we now call it, but also morphic resonance, a broader view of inheritance and a different view of memory, our own memory. And for me, this was an attempt to explore a different way of looking at the unsolved problems of biology. I put forward evidence that supported this view. I put forward experiments that could be done to test it. And since then, I've done many of these experiments. They're summarized in the latest edition of A New Science of Life called Morphic Resonance in the US. But when this book came out, some people were very interested. It got a lot of favorable publicity in Britain, in The Guardian, in New Scientist, and elsewhere. But this became more and more annoying for hardcore materialists like the editor of Nature, who was called John Maddox. And after a few months, he wrote this famous editorial on the front page of Nature called A Book for Burning, denouncing my book, comparing it unfavorably to Hitler's Mein Kampf, and basically excommunicating me from the scientific world. So I became too dangerous to know. This was, he later, in an interview on BBC television, said, Sheldrake deserves to be condemned in the same language and for the same reasons as the Pope condemned Galileo. It's heresy. I mean, it was the most unfortunate comparison for him to make. I mean,
it was a compliment.
Well, it was. He did, but he said it. He didn't say it with a twinkle in his eye. There's a clip you can see on YouTube of him actually saying this on BBC television. He was really angry, and he compared himself to the Pope and me to Galileo. Well, it was obviously a very unfortunate comparison, but what it shows so clearly is this idea of heresy is deeply embedded in any dogmatic framework of thinking. And so my point really in my book, Science Set Free, is that the sciences would be much better off if they could question the assumptions and move beyond them instead of saying these have to be true. So what I do in that book is take the 10 standard dogmas of science and turn them into questions. Dogma 1 is nature is mechanical or machine-like. So that becomes the question, is nature mechanical? Question 2, dogma 2, nature is unconscious, matter is unconscious. Is matter unconscious? Is nature unconscious? The laws of nature are fixed. Are the laws of nature fixed? So you see, when you turn these dogmas into questions, then the whole debate can open up and you can say, well, maybe they are, maybe they're not. Let's look at the evidence. Which way should we go? That, I think, is the way science should be proceeding. And that's why my book's called Science Set Free in the United States. Because my aim there is to help to liberate scientific thinking from this narrow dogmatism, which will make it more interesting and more fun.
That's brilliant. You talked about, you mentioned epigenetics.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by it because in my book, Bottom Up Revolution, I talk about how we're kind of coming back to a more bottom up, from my definition, which is people connecting to each other and more interdependent. we're returning to the way we were before civilization kind of repressed a lot of that aspect of being human. And I've kind of attributed it to a reawakening, a flowering of the epigenetic potential that we have that was repressed. But hearing you, and I even mentioned you in my book, talking about how morphic fields are a part of this. And so, and having this conversation, it makes me think even more that we've got all these millions of years of being human where we connected with each other, where we helped each other, and the morphic fields are there. Now, you talked, in terms of the crystals, you talked about nucleation. And it sounds like, in a sense, what morphic fields do is they facilitate the nucleation of these parts of us. Is that?
Well, what they do is enable us, when something happens that's similar to something's happened before, morphic resonance enables it to happen more easily. It enables the pattern to come into being. And so I think in terms of epigenetic inheritance, there's what that is really is the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which was a huge taboo in 20th century biology. It was probably the biggest heresy in 20th century biology. It's one of the reasons I was attacked so severely, because I was suggesting that this could happen. Well, since around the year 2000, epigenetic inheritance, the inheritance of acquired characters has been rebranded epigenetic inheritance. It's now one of the hottest and most interesting areas of biology. And it's leading to a complete revision of evolutionary theory. Neo-Darwinism is the doctrine that all inheritance is based on genes, or practically all inheritance, and that genes can't be modified by experience, and that they only mutate at random occasionally. So evolution is very slow and depends on chance. Whereas in epigenetic inheritance, something an animal learns can be passed on to its offspring straight away. For example, in a famous epigenetic experiment involving laboratory mice, a few years ago, a paper published in Nature, I mean, this is mainstream conventional research now, the male mice were made to be frightened of the smell of a chemical called acetophenone. They got electric shocks when they smelled it, which it was a conditioned reflex thing. I mean, after a couple of times, they're terrified of the smell of acetophenone. Then they bred from these male mice, and their children and their grandchildren were terrified of the smell of acetophenone. And then people said, well, maybe the male mice passed on this fear by talking to the mothers and communicating to the mother. So then they did a further experiment where they took sperm from these conditioned male mice and did an in vitro fertilization, artificial insemination of the females. So they never met the fathers, and their children and grandchildren still showed this fear response. So that's a kind of experiment that in epigenetic inheritance, which shows that if there was some particularly poisonous chemical that an animal encountered that made it sick or made it ill, it would be very useful for its descendants to inherit this ability straight away, rather than waiting 100 generations for a random mutation to make the animals averse to this particular smell. So this has completely changed evolutionary theory. It's now in turmoil. Neo-Darwinism now looks incredibly old-fashioned, narrow, and dogmatic. There's many biologists are now going for what they call the extended evolutionary synthesis, which includes, as well as genes, epigenetic inheritance, the effects of social forms and patterns, cultural inheritance, horizontal gene transfer, a new a thing that's now been recognized that's not part of the standard neo-Darwinian view. And by extending it a little bit further to include morphic resonance, I think we'd have a much more inclusive, interesting, and appropriate evolutionary theory than we've had when you and I were growing up. You know, neo-Darwinism ruled the roost completely, almost unquestioned, within biology departments and within the general culture. But that was the basis of Richard Dawkins' famous book, the selfish gene. But that looks unbelievably old-fashioned and outmoded now, that approach. We've moved way beyond it.
Well, what I love is the model that you're describing is a systemic model that
Yes.
looks at the interaction of different energies and forces and them all coming together to make something exist. And that makes a lot more sense than this mechanistic old model, which worked to predict velocity and simple things, but not the most elegant, most beautiful parts of being human. And you talk about beauty. We got to talk a little bit about beauty and also about materialism. Do they fit together, or is that a separate conversation for each?
Well, it might be a separate. Well, how long have we got?
About 6 more minutes.
Okay. Well, they're both big topics. Well, I'll deal with materialism first. Materialism is a philosophy of nature that says that matter is the only reality, or physical reality is the only reality, and that unreality is basically unconscious, that there's no purpose in nature, and nature is machine-like. The mind is nothing but the activity of the brain, and consciousness doesn't do anything. You don't really have free will because everything's physically determined by the machinery of your brain. I mean, that's the materialist worldview. And it's dominated science since the 19th century. And as I show in Science Set Free, every one of its 10 main assumptions is deeply questionable. And in fact, science has superseded most of them. So we're really in a post-materialist world, but most materialists don't know that yet, because most scientists never look at the big philosophy. They're studying specialized bits of science without looking at the overall assumptions. They're not part of a science education. It's just...
What's the opposite of materialism?
Well, there's several opposites or several alternatives. The direct opposite is called idealism in philosophy. This doesn't mean idealism in the normal sense of wanting to help others and make the world a better place. It means the doctrine that the ultimate reality is conscious. Consciousness is the fundamental reality, and matter is kind of dumbed down mind. So one theory says that unconscious matter is the fundamental reality. The other one says consciousness is the fundamental reality. But you don't have to have a worldview that's just those two extremes. I myself prefer the holistic worldview, which says that nature's made up of different levels. Each level, like a cell is one level, an organ is another level, an animal's another level, a flock of birds, a society of animals is another level, an ecosystem, a planet, a solar system. All these levels have wholes that are more than the sum of the parts. And all of them have a kind of mind, potentially consciousness associated with it. They also have many habits. And I'm not saying here that everything's unconscious matter or everything's just conscious. Consciousness is the only reality. It's a view that takes nature seriously, that acknowledges nature of consciousness within nature, acknowledges the reality of matter as physical processes, and doesn't involve going to either of these extremes. It's all nothing but unconscious matter, or it's all nothing but consciousness. It's more of an inclusive view, and that's the one I prefer myself. When we count, now beauty, finally, I don't have long, 1 minute? Three, all right. Well, I gave a talk called Why Is There So Much Beauty in the World? Because I think this is a real mystery. Flowers have been around for 60 million years, at least probably 100 million years. And as Darwin pointed out, there couldn't have been a flower until there was an eye to see it. Flowers are an interaction between plants and animal minds. But there were no human minds around when flowers first evolved. We didn't appear until much, much more recently. Modern humans, 500,000 million years. So the majority of flower evolution, all the main families of flowering plants, happened because insects could see them, bees, butterflies, and other insects. And how is it that an insect mind, which is very, very simple, with a very simple brain, could drive the evolution of the exquisite flowers that exist in the world? It means the insects must have had a sense of beauty that went way beyond the functional requirements of collecting pollen and stuff to give all those different kinds of orchids and daisies and so on. I mean, so many kinds of flowers. There seems to be gratuitous beauty in the world. Butterfly wings, incredibly beautiful. Darwin, I'm sure, was partly right. It's sexual selection. The prettiest one gets the girl or gets the guy. But that presupposes a sense of beauty in the ones that are doing the choosing. The peahens get to choose the peacock with the biggest and best and most beautiful tail. But what gives them a sense of beauty, which has driven the evolution of the peacock feathers and the evolution of the peacock tails? So Darwinism helps explain some forms of beauty through sexual selection or natural selection, but it doesn't explain the sense of beauty itself. And that is a kind of mystery. I think there's a mystery within nature. Traditional views say that the ultimate consciousness underlying all nature has the three main properties of truth, beauty, and goodness. That truth, beauty, and goodness are built into the very fundamental of the whole of nature. And beauty is there because it's so fundamental to the entire world. That I find a more persuasive model than simply trying to explain it piecemeal through natural selection and sexual selection.
And to finish, it makes me wonder, is morphic field influence species centric?
Well, each species has its own kind of morphic resonance because it's more similar to other members of the species. But species can form symbiotic relationships with other species, and domesticated animals like dogs have evolved along with the human species over hundreds of thousands of generations. So that there's a morphic field for the human-dog relationship, if you like. In dogs, they've grown up over so many generations with humans as part of their world. That's what they want. That's what they're expecting. That's what they're used to. It's what they need. I mean, dogs can go feral, of course, and live with other dogs, reverting to a wild form. But dogs have grown up under conditions of domestication. And sometimes species, the morphic resonance from one species could influence other species. Sometimes in evolution, I think it can jump from one part of the world to the other, accounting for parallel evolution. And in the human realm, parallel inventions. There are many examples of people in different parts of the world coming up with similar ideas around the same time. And instead of saying they had to get those through people floating around on balsa wood rafts or something like that, morphic resonance could help explain parallel evolution and parallel cultural evolution as well.
One last question. You've referred a lot to connection. What are your thoughts about connection?
Well, connection is what links things together in larger patterns of meaning or mutual influence. And I mean, basically, the whole of nature is interconnected. We're interconnected through our social lives, through language, through the internet. Animals are interconnected with other members of the social group. We're all interconnected with the natural world through the way we get our food. The earth is interconnected with the sun through the sunlight that powers the natural world, and so on. I mean, everywhere you look, there's interconnection. It's the very nature of things to be interconnected. And even the most egocentric billionaire couldn't have got there without all the people who work for him or her, or all the people who want to know about him or her and his or her super yacht through gossip columns and that sort of thing. So even the most egocentric individuals rely on interconnection. Without it, they wouldn't survive for a moment. They wouldn't have any food. They wouldn't have anyone to supply them with food. So it's simply a fact. undeniable fact.
Okay. And I believe that we need to develop connection consciousness of all the ways we're connected to each other.
Yes, I think to recognize, first of all, that we are, and then to become grateful for that fact, and then to become more aware of it. Yes, I agree with you.
No, we could be going on for hours, but you've given me more time than you promised, and I really appreciate it. My guest for this show has been Rupert Sheldrake. He's a biologist, author of 14 books. His website is sheldrake.org, sheldrake.org. His newest book is Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Good to be with you. Bye for now.